February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of crude oil reserves remaining. After that, the lights go out. Permanently. Washington announces new tariffs targeting any country that sells oil to Cuba. Moscow pledges necessary support. Beijing condemns the economic siege. Mexico suspends commercial shipments while promising humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, in Havana, the blackouts stretch 26 hours straight, hospitals operate without medication, and food prices exceed monthly salaries by factors of 10. This isn't 1962, where superpowers negotiated over Cuba's head. This is 2026, where an island 90 miles from Miami becomes the testing ground for whether economic warfare can force regime change without invasion, and whether Russia and China will actually confront American dominance when the cost gets real. Let's trace how Cuba arrived at this precipice, and what it's like to be a part of the world's most powerful and most powerful country. Let's trace how Cuba arrived at this precipice, and what it's like to be a part of the world's most powerful and most powerful country. Let's trace how Cuba arrived at this precipice, and what it's like to be a part of the world's most powerful and most powerful country. What happens when the countdown hits zero? January 3rd, 2026. 2 a.m., Caracas. Delta Force operators, backed by CIA intelligence, storm Nicolas Maduro's compound. Explosions light up northern Venezuela as U.S. bombers suppress air defenses. Dozens die in the raid. Maduro gets photographed aboard USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, soundproof headphones, bound for New York arraignment on narco-terrorism charges. Among the dead, 32 Cuban soldiers are killed. The U.S. military's forces are also dispatched to Cuba. Cuba's military is also dispatched to Cuba. Cuban military and intelligence personnel. Because Cuba didn't just support Venezuela diplomatically, Cuba effectively ran Venezuela's security apparatus. 32,000 Cuban operatives embedded in Venezuelan intelligence, internal security, even Maduro's personal protection detail. When Delta Force captured Maduro, they killed Cuba's economic model. Here's why. Venezuela supplied Cuba with 46,500 barrels of oil per day before that raid. The oil was subsidized crude at below market rates, the arrangement that kept Cuban lights on since Hugo Chavez declared the two countries living in a sea of happiness back in 1999. Cuba sent troops, intelligence, and regime protection. Venezuela sent oil. That partnership terminated the moment Maduro got arrested. Mexico had been Cuba's secondary supplier, 17,000 barrels per day. Within weeks of the Venezuela operation, those shipments halted too, under pressure from Trump administration threats to weaponize USMCA renegotiation. Do the math. Cuba loses roughly 63,700 barrels daily. Cuba needs approximately 60,000 barrels per day just to maintain basic electricity. There's no margin. There's no backup plan. There's just the countdown clock. Cuba didn't just lose oil. It lost the revenue stream from reselling Venezuelan crude at market rates while paying subsidized prices, hard currency that financed food and medicine imports. That income, gone. The military partnership anchoring Cuba's regional security posture, dissolved. The assumption that great power patrons would seamlessly replace Venezuela if something went wrong, not about to get tested. Venezuela-Cuba wasn't just an oil deal. It was the economic architecture that allowed Cuba's system to survive after Soviet subsidies ended. Between 1999 and 2013, Chavez supplied up to 100,000 barrels daily. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a day. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba provided the security expertise that kept Chavez, and later Maduro, in power against coup attempts, protests, and internal threats. Cuban operatives trained Venezuelan intelligence services, monitored military loyalty, protected the president personally. When Maduro faced his own survival crises, Cuban personnel were the regime's backbone. But here's what that partnership masked: structural economic decay. While Venezuelan oil kept the generation of oil, Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba's oil prices were up to $1.5 billion a year. Cuba's domestic production collapsed. Sugar harvests that historically measured in millions of metric tons, down to 165,000 tons in 2024-25. Real wages adjusted for inflation, down 96% since 2015. Agricultural mechanization, farmers switching from tractors back to oxen, which then gets stolen for food because people are starving. The dependency created a fatal vulnerability. When your economy runs on oil, you're not going to get any more oil. 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 When someone runs on someone else's oil like a patient runs on an IV drip, you don't diversify. You don't reform. You don't build resilience. You assume the drip continues, because it always has, until January 3rd when someone cut the line. This is the Venezuela lesson applied to Cuba. Patron-client relationships work until the patron implodes or gets regime changed by a superpower. Then your model dies too. Cuba didn't have to prepare for this scenario because for 25 years it never happened. Now it's happening in real time. And there are 15 days of reserves left. January 29th, 2026. One day before Secretary of State Marco Rubio testifies to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about Cuba policy, President Trump signs Executive Order 14380. The mechanics. The Commerce and State Departments identify which countries sell oil to Cuba. The president sets tariff rates on goods from those countries. If shipments continue, tariffs escalate. The TAFEL, a oil commissioner's grant, 3 move into Cuba, which will NHP pelvis pressure years on end. Cuba promises to repeatedly or uniquely M2 Female Development Office. Concerning political war, Cuba stands near the USA headquarters. We are on a war map of incredible opportunity and success. We apply a specific policy scheme. We try to do human and supplies that impact people and Casastro ideology across the hemisphere. But listen to Rubio's Senate testimony on January 28th. He acknowledges explicitly regime change is the goal. The 1996 Helms-Burton Act codifies the embargo until Cuba's government changes. Title III, activated by Trump in 2019 after 20 years dormant, allows U.S. nationals to sue Cuban entities for properties expropriated after 1959. The Supreme Court is hearing cases on whether Cuban government entities lose sovereign immunity, creating pathways to seize Cuban assets globally if regime change succeeds. This isn't about human rights accountability. It's about economic siege as regime change doctrine. Mexico feels the pressure immediately. Republican lawmakers Carlos Jimenez, Mario Diaz-Balart, Maria Elvira Salazar explicitly threatened to weaponize USMCA renegotiation if Mexico keeps selling oil to Cuba. Trump personally requests President Claudia Sheinbaum suspend shipments. Sheinbaum navigates an impossible tightrope. Her leftist orientation demands solidarity with Cuba, but Mexican economic survival depends on avoiding tariffs that would devastate exports. Her compromise? Commercial oil sales halted under pressure, humanitarian assistance, food and goods via Mexican Navy, pledged and delivered. Oil shipments for humanitarian reasons remain under diplomatic negotiation. The distinction matters legally, but functionally, Cuba's losing those 17,000 barrels per day. The international community votes 165-7 against the embargo at the UN General Assembly. International law scholars call secondary sanctions tariffs on third countries for their independent transactions, violations of sovereignty. The U.S. frames it as accountability for a regime that tortures dissidents and imprisons 650 political prisoners from July 2021 protests. Washington turned oil into a choke point. Now the question? Who is willing to break the blockade and who just makes promises while satellites track empty tanker routes? Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls the U.S. pressure unacceptable, pledges necessary political and material support, condemns Executive Order 14380 as illegal under the UN Charter. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova frames this as Washington's most important step towards the end of the disaster. The U.S.'s first and most important and most critical step in the history of the U.S. is the U.S. military. The U.S. military is the last military to be launched in the United States. It is the last military to be launched in the United States. The U.S. military, which is the only Russian-American military, is the second largest military to Zakharova frames. This as Washington's maximum pressure strategy, violating international law. Here's what they're actually doing. Rosneft loaded 100,000 tons of crude onto the academic Gubkin in January, expected mid-February arrival, at Cuba's Matanzas terminal. 100,000 tons translates to roughly 20 days of consumption at current rates. That buys time. It doesn't solve the crisis. And the volumes are declining. Russia sent 600,000 tons in 2022, 200,000 in 2023, 100,000 in 2024. Russia's constrained by Ukraine war resource demands, sanctions targeting its shadow fleet, and limited capacity for major Caribbean commitments. Moscow maintains the Lord's intelligence facility, demonstrating global reach, but won't risk direct U.S. confrontation over Cuba. Signaling presence is one thing. Sustaining a besieged economy 90 miles per hour is another. Beijing condemns the blockade, pledges as much support as possible, votes with the 165-nation majority against the embargo. China frames this as principled opposition to unilateral coercive measures violating sovereignty. What's missing? Confirmed oil shipments. China's investing in Cuban infrastructure, holding diplomatic meetings, signaling great power status. But Chinese tankers aren't sailing for Havana. Beijing won't challenge U.S. hemispheric dominance for Cuba when the risks include economic retaliation that could cascade through China's core interests. The telling silence. Rhetoric costs nothing. Crude oil deliveries cost real money and carry real consequences. That gap defines great power solidarity. Sheinbaum's caught between revolutionary solidarity. Her political base expects support for Cuba and economic survival. Pemex supplies only 3% of crude exports to Cuba. Minimal economically, massive politically. The reality? If Sheinbaum caves completely, Cuba hits zero in 15-20 days. If she defies Trump, Mexico risks tariffs dwarfing Cuba's strategic importance. So she splits the difference. Humanitarian aid flows, commercial sales stop, and diplomatic negotiations continue while the clock ticks. Mexico's the only realistic near-term supplier with proximity and capacity, and Washington knows it. The oil deliveries get tracked by satellite. While diplomats talk, Cuba's reserves drain. Here's what that looks like on the ground. 26 hours of blackouts consecutively in many regions. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant offline, eliminating 200 megawatts. National deficit hits 75% of demand during peak hours. Kepler energy analyst Victoria Grabenwoga. Cuba can function for 15 to 20 days at current consumption. After that, energy costs drop. Energy collapse. No electricity means no water pumping. Artemisa province, 83% water access reduction. Havana, 80%. No refrigeration means food spoilage. No hospital equipment. No public transport. The peso lost 10% in 3 weeks as of early February, down 88% since 2020. Informal exchange rate, 405 pesos per dollar versus the official 24. Food prices in early 2026. Potatoes, 450 pesos per pound. Onions, 380. Beans, 500. Meat, 1,000. Earn a modest grocery purchase, 10,300 pesos. Average state worker salary, 6,830 pesos monthly. Teachers, 5,495. Healthcare workers, 6,562. A Cuban doctor earning 4,500 pesos, roughly $16 at informal rates, by income from in chikungunya, 38 out of 938 cases, 33 deaths in 1 week in late 2025, 21 of them minors. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, antibiotics, basic supplies. Patients sent home to rest without treatment because medications don't exist. The Metalip company expands plant-based syrups, oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, not because they work, but because there's nothing else. A 69-year-old housekeeper, her 10-minute commute now takes 4 hours round trip due to transportation collapse, cost consuming her wages. A 32-year-old woman, survival nothing else. Neither government offers hope. Taxi drivers at Digital Q position 2,900, estimating 2 months to reach the front for fuel, sold in dollars at inflated prices. This is what maximum pressure looks like in practice. While Washington, Moscow, and Beijing play chess, Cubans count hours of darkness. Now the question, can the regime survive what's coming? President Miguel Diaz-Canel's messaging: defiant, uncompromising, revolutionary. Patria o muerte. We will never surrender. Dialogue possible on equal terms, with respect, without preconditions, but dialogue cannot occur under pressure. Military readiness rhetoric, war of the entire people exercises. National Defense Day invoking the cost imperialism would pay for attacking Cuba. References to the 32 Cubans killed fighting U.S. forces in Venezuela, but the constraints tell a different story. Cuban military declined from 300,000 personnel to 60,000 during earlier crises. Training suspended due to resource shortages. Agriculture switching from tractors to oxen, which gets stolen for food. Tourism down 72% through April 2025. Sugar production, 165,000 tons versus historical millions. The Economic Commission for the Latin America forecasts Cuba's GDP shrinking 1.5% in 2025, barely any growth in 2026, second worst in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. The cohesion question. Does the Giza military apparatus maintain elite unity when they can't provision their own supporters? Do factions emerge around negotiation versus resistance strategies? 650 political prisoners still jailed from 2021 protests. Repression capacity intact but public exhaustion deepening. Trump's strategy remains ambiguous. Public messaging. Cuba is ready to fall. Going down for the count. I don't think we need any action. Also, I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba. No term specified. Politico reports naval blockade under discussion. Energy is chokehold to kill the regime. The regime says it won't surrender. Washington says collapse is inevitable. Neither claim tells you what happens in the next 30 days. Snipers. International support provides just enough to prevent total failure, but not restoration. Crisis becomes permanent condition. 12-hour blackouts. Severe scarcity. Security apparatus maintains control. Population lacks organization for sustained uprising. Special period 2.0. Indefinite duration. Scenario 3, internal fracture. Oil runs out completely. Services collapse. Elite unity breaks when Giza can't feed its own. Military coup, reformist transition, or negotiated exit depending on whether factions see survival and change versus doubling down. Scenario 4, external intervention. Naval blockade to halt all oil imports. Supreme Court ruling potentially jeopardizing IEPA. Authority forces military option. Russian and Chinese response unknown. Unlikely but not impossible if humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure for rescue operation. Scenario 5. Unexpected stabilization. Russia or China dramatically increase support as multipolarity demonstration. Trump accepts face-saving deal. Venezuelan transition government restores limited flows. Requires all major actors shifting positions simultaneously. 5 scenarios, 1 countdown, 15 to 20 days of oil. Cuba validates what Venezuela proved. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse when the patron disappears. Venezuela had oil infrastructure to reactivate post-Maduro. Cuba has nothing but hope for external rescue. Russia and China pledge solidarity, but won't risk direct confrontation with the U.S. in its sphere of influence. Symbolic shipments buy time, don't change trajectories. Multipolar world order means rhetorical support and limited material aid, not decisive intervention. The U.S. is a global leader in the world of oil. The U.S. is a global leader in the world of oil. The U.S. is a global leader in the world of oil. The U.S. is a global leader in the world of oil. The U.S. is a global leader in the world of oil. Right, not yield political propaganda and are the plans cut off. It's 11 million people facing blackouts, hunger, disease outbreaks. Full and Cora oil count has no ideology. Cartridges per day. Right, not yield political propaganda. That doesn't work by March 2026. Number 3. Tamu Week 9th, 10th career did hassle Venezuela. Japanese captured Maduro on January 3rd might have signed Cuba's death warrant. Or it might force the regime change Washington's pursued for 65 years. Or it might trigger the great power confrontation everyone tried to avoid. It's February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of oil left. The countdown continues. The verdict isn't in yet, but the clock is running. If this breakdown of geopolitical chess and human survival changes how you view the headlines, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. and tracking the collapses they can't hide. Join us as we document the next chapter. The next revelation is coming soon.